Hi. So, good evening, everybody. Welcome to this week's Tuesday night wine chat, and I'm delighted to be joined by Richard Bampfield, Master of Wine. Richard, you're a Master of Wine. You're a past chair of the Association of Wine Educators, European Champagne Ambassador 2009. You're a top wine judge. You work with Lidl, Leith School of Food and Wine, a number of different wineries around the globe through your consultancy. So I'm so chuffed to have you with us this evening in such esteemed company.
And I'm honoured to be invited, Tony. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Now, we first met at the Love Wine Festival in Birmingham with Laura Clay, a mutual friend of ours. You then hosted an amazing champagne dinner with us a year later at Hotel du Vin. I've had the opportunity to sit on a number of your different wine masterclasses through the Love Wine Festival. But probably the biggest reason why you are on my mind very regularly, Richard, is that every time I go to the wine aisle of Lidl, I see your smiling face giving me advice on what wine to buy. So you're never far from my thoughts on a regular basis, particularly now we've got a Lidl here in Shirley, just around the corner from where I live.
This is virtually rather than physically, of course, Tony.
Virtually rather than physically, yeah. I mean, I feel like there's a bit of spirit of Richard Bampfield there coming through the aisle to me, recommending those wines. So thank you so much for that and for joining us tonight. Now, we're definitely going to talk about Lidl and get some recommendations from you. But this is also, it's your 30th anniversary year of being a Master of Wine.
It is, and it's extraordinary. I think the old adage that I've probably forgotten much more than I ever learned is true. But yes, 30 years as a Master of Wine, and loved every minute.
I'm sure. Yeah. Now, I think when people think of a Master Sommelier or Master of Wine, they think they're going to talk at such high level. I won't understand what they're talking about, but you know, it's a big thing for you about making wine accessible, isn't it?
It's become more and more important to me. Look, I know some people must assume that we're drinking class growth claret and Grand Cru Burgundy all the time. It's simply not true. Not for me anyway. It would be for some of my peers because that is their job. They're involved in that sector. I haven't been. I've been involved in other parts of the business, and really, fascinating parts of the business, as I think we're going to talk about. But I increasingly, and this was already happening before I started working with Lidl. I've always been interested in talking with the public as opposed to talking with other trade professionals.
Yeah.
And when you are presenting a lot with the public, as you know, you learn so much about what people really are looking for and the challenges they have when they're selecting wine, because you listen to the questions they're asking, and they're not always the questions that wine labels are answering.
Yeah,
in fact,
sure.
I think most of the time they're not the questions that wine labels are answering. And so, yes, it has become a mission of mine in a way to do what I can to help that, which takes various different forms. Yes.
Now, so over those 30 years, you must have seen a lot of change in the wine world. How have people's wine taste changed during that time, would you say?
You know, I'm still not convinced that wine tastes have actually changed that much. Yeah. I think as we grow older, our personal tastes change. So we might start off liking sweeter things, then we go towards liking drier things. And as we get older, many people tend to like sweeter things again. Some of us, like me, like everything all the way through, which makes it complicated. But I'm not convinced we've changed that much. I look at the wines that I started off in retail. I spent 8 years working in a retail environment. Yeah. And I look at what was selling then. The whites that were selling then were the less expensive German wines, Liebfraumilch, Niersteiner, Peace Porter. They were off-dry, not necessarily sweet, off-dry, fruity whites. The best-selling reds were things like Piat d'Or and wines of that ilk.
Yeah.
They weren't dry.
Yeah.
They were medium dry. They were medium. They were fruity. I look at what's selling best now. You know, we say, oh, we've matured. Now we're drinking Chilean Merlot and Australian Shiraz and Sauvignon Blanc. Well, yes, but a lot of that Sauvignon Blanc from New Zealand isn't bone dry.
No.
Most of that Chilean Merlot at the lower price points isn't bone dry. And I question whether our taste has actually changed that much. I think what has changed is what is fashionable and our perception of what we like, rather than our taste itself.
And of course, fashion drives so much of what we're drinking, don't we? They say that, you know, Birmingham, according to a Laithwaite survey, is the capital of Sauvignon Blanc in the UK. There's a higher percentage of Sauvignon Blanc consumed in Birmingham, apparently. But yeah, so much is driven by...
I think Birmingham should be quite proud of that, actually. I think that's pretty good. It's a good choice. There's a lot duller wines out there than Sauvignon Blanc, that's for sure.
Absolutely. Now, look, I was really interested to learn about the time you've spent working in different cellars and vineyards, you know, a few years ago during your career. Really hard work, I'm guessing, but quite fun as well.
Fabulous fun. I'll show my hands now. My hands are clean these days. Not nearly enough time working in the cellar, but it was an experience that changed the whole trajectory of my career. I won't go into too much detail, but I worked in retail for about 8 years, and then I travelled the world visiting vineyards and cellars around the world, and I worked in vineyards and cellars mainly in Napa Valley and in Australia, and it totally changed what I knew about wine. Everything I'd studied in the UK was about the theory and about the market, if you want, or learnt about the market. What I learnt there was the practical side, how grapes are grown, how wines are made, and I learnt about it practically, getting my hands dirty and actually doing some of the things, whether it's pumping over or pumping or punching down the Mar in a barrel of Pinot Noir, whatever it might be. But it's the practical side. That's what was missing to my wine education. And I was away for about 10 months and I filled those gaps. And it was when I got back that I realized that actually taking on the Master of Wine was probably manageable because I'd filled the gaps in my knowledge. Sure. And it was huge fun. I still look back on those days of working in cellars with a lot of affection, a lot of joy, and quite sentimentally. Yeah.
And understanding the work that goes behind creating something that we just take for granted and enjoy to drink and pour out of the bottle.
It is. There's an awful lot of, very little of it is glamorous.
Yeah.
I mean, I know we think it should be, but very little of what goes into making a bottle of wine is glamorous. The vineyard bit is hard work, most of it. It's not about just walking through the vines and tasting the grapes every other day. There's an awful lot of hard work that goes in there. And in the cellars, most of it is dirty. And the biggest change, you asked about changes in palate, but the biggest change is hygiene.
Yeah.
And this is the amazing thing that people don't really realise. But some of the viewers might be old enough to have visited wine cellars in Europe 30 or 40 years ago. Most of the time they were filthy. Yeah. I remember visiting cellars and they were proud of the dirty gravels on the floor and the cobwebs and the rare mould on the ceiling and all the rest of it. They were proud of all of that. But they were really dirty. And wine was much more unpredictable as a result because there were far more possible faults, really.
Yeah.
What has changed is hygiene. And now you go into most cellars all over the world and they may be old, but they're clean. And they understand the importance of hygiene in both the cellar and in winemaking. It's been a massive difference.
In many cases, they are a showcase as well, aren't they? As you said, I mean, they might have been proud to show you their rare mould, but actually there's some stunning cellars. I was lucky enough to go to Perrier Jouet, which I was encouraging everyone to go until I found out it's invitation only, and then I got a kick under the table from our representative from PJ. But listen, we've got a number of people with us tuned in on Facebook or joined us directly on Zoom this evening. So I'm just going to name check a few people. We've got the Roses, Mark and Claire, Clifford Dobson, Dominic Buckwell, Francesca, Ian Blake, John Del Ross, Marie, Helena Brown, Sheila and Paul, Sue, Warwick and Joe, William. So William's actually asking, are you drinking tonight? Which is probably a bit of a, that's the first silly question this evening, William, I think. We both definitely are. And if so, what are you drinking? So what are you drinking, Richard?
Well, I'm drinking, and I'm not sure, sort of shows up. I'm drinking something which I can guarantee none of the rest of you will be drinking. It's a German Trocken, so it's a dry German wine, and it's made from a blend of Sauvignon Blanc and Weissburgunder, which is Pinot Blanc. And it's just delightful, with the Sauvignon giving freshness and aromatics, the Weissburgunder giving a bit of body, and it's just lovely wine. This is a wine that I would love the Lidl in the UK to sell, but actually this is sold by Lidl in Germany. But it is, it's really enjoyable. In summer, and okay, it's not the hottest evening this evening, but light German whites. This is 12% alcohol. This is exactly what I enjoy drinking. And so, and also I know that I can drink, we're going to be on air for an hour or so. I can drink this through an hour on air. And even if I get through a couple of glasses, hopefully I'll still be relatively coherent. Yeah. So, yeah, that's what I'm drinking.
And William, apologies for that. Just teasing you there. Here's my glass too. I'll tell you what I'm drinking in a moment. But Richard, what have you got cooling your bottle? You've got quite an interesting little instrument there.
This is, yeah. It's a wine chiller. It's a wine chiller. Okay, so this is, it's a rod, if you want, a glass rod that you keep in the freezer. And when you've got a bottle of wine that you want to keep chilled, or you want to chill, although I think it's better if you start with a wine chilled in the first place, you just take half a glass out, then you can stick this into the bottle. There's a cork at the top, and it will keep the remainder cold. And it's I find it quite useful. I just keep it in the freezer. And if I'm feeling lazy or it's hot outside or whatever, I find it quite fun. Obviously, incredibly easy to maintain. You just rinse it under the tap to clean it, then stick it back in the freezer. So yes, that's what I've got in my bottle.
Very good. And I do the Christmas tree as well, I'm sure.
I do. You could. I've been given all sorts of wine gadgets as presents in my time. Most of them totally useless. Fortunately, this one I rather like. It's great. It's not good enough to chill a wine when you're starting with it's warm, but it is good enough to keep a wine reasonably chilled if it's already quite cold.
Yeah. Now, I am on brand also. I've got a lovely drop of Albarino from Lidl, Salnaval Barrica, which tells us that it's an oaked Albarino. And I love Albarino. The only time I've tried oaked Albarino was on a nice tour of Galicia a couple of years ago, and actually visited this particular winery. It was with great delight that when I pulled the cork, I saw it was one of my favourite Galician winery, which is Condes de Albarrey. And there's a whole nother story about how the drug lords had their palace confiscated, and it's now a winery. But it's a lovely drop of wine, one that you're familiar with, and it's kind of developed over different vintages.
It has. One of the things I love about working with Lidl is that I'm trying certain wines year after year. Yeah. And I can remember how I found them in previous years most of the time, or I've got notes I can refer to if I choose to. And about 4 years ago, when I first tried this particular wine, the one you're drinking, the oak was just too heavy. Albarino is quite a delicate grape. And I really like that delicacy, the freshness, the aromatics. And the oak was just too strong for it. And nothing to do with my influence, but in recent years, I think they've just learnt how to use the oak a bit more sensitively. And this particular vintage that you're drinking, I think they've got it spot on. And the oak adds complexity and richness, but they still retain the natural freshness and liveliness of the Albarino grape.
We've got some real Chardonnay fans tuned in this evening. The Roses in particular, I know would enjoy the oaked nature of this wine. So we'll make sure we buy some more for next time we meet up with you guys. Now, I'm guessing that 1990, newly appointed Master of Wine that must have opened a few doors for you.
Sorry, Tony?
Becoming Master of Wine in 1990, that must have opened a few doors for you, Richard.
It's a fantastic thing. And yes, it did. At the time, I was still working in retail. Within a few months, I started working for Brown Brothers, which I think I would have done anyway, but it helped that I'd become a Master of Wine. In the early 1990s, Australian wine was still making its way. It was doing well, and the signs were promising, but there were still certain customers and certain markets that were very, very unreceptive to Australian wines. And being an MW, we're treated with unconditional respect wherever we go. And if I was introducing Australian wines to a skeptical audience, it really helped that I was an MW. And yeah, they still might not go along with me, but at least they'd listen to me. And that gave me an advantage over some of my peers at the time, certainly. And there is still, even in those days, there must have been about 150 MWs in the world. These days, there's getting on for 400. Mm-hmm. But that was still pretty thinly spread around the world. And we still receive exactly the same levels of respect, which is a joy and a total privilege. And it has the work I do now, the diversity of clients that I have, I don't believe I would have if I wasn't a Master of Wine.
Well, yeah, well deserved, as William has said in the comments just there. Now, you were with Brown Brothers for some 9 years, so you must have been quite fond of that role, I'm guessing.
I adored and adore Brown Brothers. Fascinating business, and a really good example of a medium-sized business that understands its place in the wine world. Mm-hmm. It's very, the wine world is becoming, as we're so aware, increasingly polarized. And you've really got to be the biggest, or the best, and therefore the most expensive, or the cheapest. And or a combination of those three. If you're stuck in the middle, it's really difficult. It's difficult to find routes to market because it's hard to supply supermarkets if you're not one of the big boys. And you're too big just to sell to small wine merchants or to sell, through cellar door. So it's really difficult for people caught in that middle ground. And they've got to be very, very innovative in both their marketing and I think their approach to production. And that's exactly what Brown Brothers have always been. When everybody else in Australia was concentrating on Chardonnay, Shiraz and Cabernet Sauvignon, Brown Brothers were growing Muscat, Tempranillo, Prosecco. They were looking in other directions. They've always been ahead of the curve in terms of thinking, what can we do differently? And what they've been very smart at, and I don't think they'll mind me saying this, they found grapes that are relatively cheap to grow, and they've turned them into really good wines. Yeah. And that's possible in Australia. You've got a good climate, you've got very good technical skills, and it is key. If you're growing Shiraz in Australia, the base price is a lot higher than it would be for Muscat or something like that. And the Brown family have always been fantastic at converting relatively inexpensive grapes into very, I think, sophisticated tasting wines.
Now, Australia gets a bit of a bad rap, I think, because it's been so popular, it was so fashionable, and so therefore it becomes unfashionable. But there's a lot more to Australian wine than those big household names, isn't there?
There is a great deal, and I think it's a funny one. I know that a lot of the public have turned away from this sort of oaky Chardonnays and big, really gutsy Shirazes they associate Australia with from the 1990s and early 2000s, and I can understand that. Australia really has moved away from that. It's very rare to find an Australian Chardonnay these days that fits into that mould. And I think many of the wines have a freshness that they can still be big, they can still be quite gutsy and really full flavoured, but I think they have a freshness that maybe they didn't always have in those days. The Australian wine industry, modern Australian wine industry, is still relatively young by European standards, and they've learnt incredibly fast. And over the last 20 years, the Australian wine styles have evolved enormously. And I do think, don't get me wrong, I think we know that in supermarkets, the best-selling wines are Australian wines. They still outsell France, Italy, any other country. So people still really like what Australia's doing at the less expensive end of the market. But it's what Australia is doing a bit higher up that is really exciting. And I would just encourage people to try slightly more expensive Australian wines. If you're used to buying in the, I don't know, £6 to £8 category, just see what you can get in 10 to 12. And then you're finding wines from more defined regions, better parts of Australia for grape growing, for making quality wines, anyway, high quality wines. And you can find some fantastic value. And I'm a great believer, and I know this may sound strange for someone whose main client is Lidl, but I'm a great believer in the fact that you can find value at every price point.
Yeah.
Certainly up to £50 a bottle.
Mm-hmm.
I think you can find genuine value.
Yeah.
And Australia, if you're prepared to pay 10 to 15 or 10 to 20 pounds a bottle, some of the value is just sensational. And there are world-class wines, red and white, which deserve, I think, a bit more recognition than they're getting at the moment.
Yeah. Now, Paul and Sheila sent a question in earlier for you, talking about Chardonnay, some recommendations for great value, oaked Chardonnay and unoaked Chardonnay. And I know you've got an interesting answer to one of those. I'm sure to both, but a particularly interesting answer to one.
I know however I answer this, I'm going to upset some people. But unoaked Chardonnay, for the most part, for me, is rather pointless. Chardonnay is a very neutral grape. It hasn't got a lot of character. It tends to command a higher price. If you want a neutral wine, you're better off buying a Pinot Grigio than a cheap Chardonnay. And the only unoaked Chardonnay that has any real reputation is Chablis. And Chablis is very different. They do have very different climate, very different soils, and much lower production levels than in Australia, for instance. So Chablis is different, and it certainly isn't cheap. So unoaked Chardonnay, I haven't a clue, to be honest. It's not an area I drink. I just find it a bit dull. Oaked Chardonnay, totally different. I think some of the well-known brands do it really well. Yalumba have got some good Chardonnay. Wolf Blass yellow label Chardonnay is really pretty good. I think it's a good drink. But again, if you're prepared to pay just a little bit more, the Yalumba, I dare say these days it's probably £7 or £8. If you're prepared to pay 10 to 12, then you'll find wines from better regions, Yarra Valley or possibly Adelaide Hills, certainly Limestone Coast and Padthaway, Western Australia maybe. Then I think you're getting some better quality oak Chardonnay. Just one other thing to throw in there, Tony. For many years, I was very critical of oaked Chardonnay from New Zealand. I just didn't think they got it right in terms of the oaking and in terms of the flavours. I never found it very refreshing. And then I visited New Zealand just over a year ago, and I was shown the error of my ways, my assumptions. And since then, I have tried quite a lot of New Zealand Chardonnay, and there's a lot of very good New Zealand Chardonnay. Again, I think it's better if you pay just a little bit more. Again, I'd be looking at 10 to 20 pounds rather than below 10. But I think there is some lovely New Zealand Chardonnays too. And I should mention South Africa, which we may come back to later as a value proposition. Some of the South African whites are just absolutely stunning. And so if we're mentioning Chardonnay, we should mention South Africa as
No, I totally agree. Now, Claire and Mark, they purchased a little Spanish Chardonnay Macabeo. Is that one that you've tried or you're familiar with?
well. Yes, I've tried that. That's from Somontano in northern Spain, which is northern Spain by definition because it's cooler. It's just better suited to making crisp, dry whites than further south. And there are some really good ones. Macabeo is a local Spanish grape. Chardonnay we know. And that for me is much more interesting than just a Chardonnay on its own. Whether it was oaked or not, I'm afraid I can't recall. I suspect that a part of it would probably have been oaked, just to give it that little bit of extra character to lift a relatively neutral unoaked Chardonnay, or unoaked Chardonnay blend.
Oh, super. Now, you're talking about value at different price points, whether it's £10 or £50, we all want value. Now, one of my favourite Richard Bampfield recommendations was actually the £13.99 Bulgari Tuscan wine from Lidl. More expensive than the Lidl champagne. Went down an absolute treat. I feel partly responsible because I've been raving about how good it was, that next time I went in, I couldn't find any. It's gone.
I haven't seen any on any shelves for weeks. So all your fault, Tony.
Yeah. Well, I know you. Was there not a Daily Mail headline as well?
There was a Daily Mail headline. I realise that most viewers to this won't have read the Daily Mail last week.
Of course.
I did. And there was a headline at the end of last week, Lidl selling £200 wine for £13.99. Which was certainly not the way that the press release was phrased, but the Daily Mail, they must be right.
So how much would we be expecting to normally pay for a bottle of wine of that quality, super Tuscan like that? How much would we expect to pay, would you say?
That's a difficult question to answer. The point that was being made was that the wine was from Bulgari in western Tuscany, on the coast of Tuscany, which is a hugely fashionable, premium red wine region. And its most famous name is Sassicaia, which does sell for £200 plus, and in many people's views, justifies it. It is one of the world's great red wines. I've only drunk it on maybe 4 or 5 occasions, and it is absolutely sensational. Do I buy it? No, because I don't buy £200 bottles of wine. But do I think it's worth it? If you're in the market to spend that sort of money, yes, it fights. Certainly it competes well against its peers at that sort of price level. But not all wine from Bulgari is Sassicaia. And I think, and there are, as we found with the Lidl wine, it is, I mean, you never find it at that price. I mean, I've never seen a Bulgari probably below £20, I don't think. No. And most of it would be significantly more than that because, wine is about branding, the same as so many products, and Bulgari commands a significant premium. And the people who have invested in vineyards there, they're not looking to make cheap wine. They're there because they want to. They would love to enjoy some of the sort of success that Sassicaia has had. That's what they're aiming for. Mm-hmm. And so the producers in Bulgari they've set their ambitions high, both in terms of wine quality and price.
Now, another newspaper article that you featured in, Richard, it said that 3 out of 5 people are buying wine the wrong way in the supermarket. Would you like to defend that position?
I suspect I will sound far too defensive. Look, first of all, I never said that. I would never accuse people of making a wrong decision. I'm not judgmental like that. Having said that, it is true that we know from research, and Lidl did some research on this, and they found that most people do buy wine in the supermarket based on what the label looks like, on the package, on the shape of the bottle, whether they like the label or not. Okay, let me put it another way. Would you buy clothes on whether you like the label or not? Would you buy a packet of biscuits on whether you like the label or not? I'm not convinced it's a really valid way of choosing a wine, but I'm also not going to criticize people for doing that. I think we've made wine unbelievably hard to buy. And as I touched on earlier, I don't think that wine labels answer most people's questions about why they should buy a particular bottle of wine. And I think we've got a problem. Maybe we're addressing it. My role at Lidl is to help address it. That's why I write the notes and we give the wine scores and we recommend serving suggestions and serving temperatures and all the rest of it, because we want to try and make it easier for people to know whether they're buying the right wine or not. But yeah, the supermarket wine aisles are not a helpful place for the most part. And so it's not surprising that people just buy. I think people buy either on the label or they buy on price, or they buy because they've had it before. They buy it because it's familiar, and that's fine. As I say, I don't criticize anyone for any of those things, but it's such a shame because the world of wine is so much more diverse than that, as we know. There's so much more to discover. And I can't help feeling that a lot of people probably aren't finding the wine they'd enjoy most because of the way we sell it at the moment.
That's why your descriptions on the labels in Lidl I find so useful. When I want to pick up a midweek wine and to hear you describe the wine, talk about the wine style, it gives you that confidence to try something you've not tried before, because actually the description suits your taste.
I think I'm glad to hear it helps. I hope it does. It's incredibly difficult to encapsulate what's special about a wine into a single sentence. Sure. It's much easier to write a long tasting note than a really short one. And it's a funny thing that if you ask the public what they want to know about a wine, very often they will say, well, I'd like to know what it tastes like. Mm. But that's really hard, because then if I say, well, it reminds me of stewed blackcurrants and, cigar smoke or something like that, they're going to think, oh, you pretentious twat. So it's very, very difficult. How are you going to describe a wine in a way that people really find helpful? And I think it's partly the way I approach it, rightly or wrong, and I'd love to know what other people think. The way I approach it is, I think partly people would like to know what it tastes like, but above all, whether it's heavy, whether it's light, whether it's smooth, whether it's sharp, whether it's high alcohol or low alcohol, this sort of thing, whether it's highly flavored or quite delicate. I think that sort of information helps. And I also think people would like to know what's special about it. Why should I buy this wine? And it could be that it's fantastic value. It could be that it comes from a really famous winemaking family. It could be that it comes from a very special part of Bordeaux. But what's special about that particular wine? I see there's a point here from William Claser, thank you, what food it goes with. I couldn't agree more. And on all our Lidl Wine talk cards, we do give a food pairing recommendation. I think that's really important. The other thing that I think is important is occasion, which I don't think we do nearly well enough in store in supermarkets. A lot of people say, well, I'm looking for a wine for a dinner party, or I want to take a bottle to a party, or it's a birthday. What should I buy? We don't give any help in that area. I find it extraordinary. I think we are still quite primitive in the wine world, in how we communicate about wines and how we merchandise.
Now, when we were chatting on Saturday morning, I was absolutely fascinated to hear from you about how your relationship works with Lidl, how Lidl are actually, they buy wine so differently to the big four. Perhaps you can expand on that for us and tell us how you come up with those scores, how that whole system works, and why Lidl are so different from the typical supermarket purchasing strategy.
Look, these are because I don't buy for Lidl, I certainly can't comment on behalf of Lidl. And so anything I say is my personal views.
Sure, yeah.
And I think that the big four, by and large, they seem to shadow each other with what they sell. You used to see a lot of the same labels. That's less the case now, because we see far more supermarket-owned labels, which I get the impression a lot of people find really reassuring, and they're quite happy with that, so that's fine. So you don't necessarily see the same labels on the shelf, but you can be fairly sure that if Tesco stock a Finest, Albarino, Sainsbury's, Morrison's, Asda will probably have something similar as well. And so there is a certain amount of shadowing, I think, what each other do. You could say the same about Aldi and Lidl as well, but it is very different. And again, it's Lidl that I know best, and at Lidl that I hope we make it easier by having a much smaller selection. I think the selection and some of my MW peers will hate me for saying this, but I think some of the supermarkets, I think the selection is ridiculously big. It just makes it so much harder to make a choice.
Yeah.
I really think we'd be better off with a smaller choice, at least in store. Online, you might choose to do something differently, or in certain stores with different demographics, you might choose to do something differently. But in the average store, I think that the selection is too large. And I like what Lidl do, because the selection is a bit tighter than that. And it is much harder to select a small range of wines than it is to select a big range of wines. If you're selecting a big range, you just say, oh, we'll have one of everything. No, we need a Barolo, we need a Barbaresco, we need a couple of Amarones. And you just go through the whole list and you have one or two of everything. That's pretty straightforward. Narrowing it down to a smaller range, and this is very true of restaurants as well, is much harder. And it's a totally different point, but I think one of the consequences of the current economic difficulties for restaurants and hotels is that we will probably see pruned down wine lists in the coming months and possibly even years, because I'm not sure they're going to be able to afford the stocks that they might have sat on before. And they will find it's much harder putting together a smaller wine list than a big one. But I think that's good. I think it basically means that each wine has got to fight. It's still got to justify its place. And I think it's easier to choose from a smaller list than a bigger one.
And of course, the current circumstances, they're going to provide perhaps their own opportunities for the consumer. Something we talked about. Whilst the on-trade is not able to, restaurants and bars are not, going through the vast stocks of wine. That does present something of a problem, doesn't it, to the winemakers?
It really does, and there's a lot of wine. Well, look, I think we know that although we may be drinking more at home, I may have been drinking more at home over the last 3 months than we normally would have done. The amount we're drinking at home hasn't compensated for the loss of restaurant and hotel sales. So wine sales overall may well be down. And particularly in the wine producing countries like France, Italy, Spain, there's a lot of evidence that wine consumption is down and has been down the last 3 or 4 months. And they're the biggest wine producing countries. They're the ones that really do drink larger volumes. So it is inevitable, I think, that there's going to be more, the balance between supply and demand will have shifted, and there will be more supply than there is demand, and that always leads to more offers. And certainly over the coming months, I will never, unless I have a specific reason to do so, be buying a wine at full price from a wine merchant or a big four supermarket. I would wait. I'll wait for the offers. because I think the offers are going to be coming. Wine suppliers are going to be desperate to sell more wine, and they will go to the routes to market that can sell largest volumes. That tends to be the supermarkets. And so I think we are going to find some really good offers. And so I'll wait for the offers and make the most of those when they come through. And I would recommend that people do get on the mailing list for Waitrose, Cellar, Majestic, M&S, Sainsbury's, Tesco, Morrison's, Co-op, for the wine offers. So when they are offering 25% off everything, you're receiving notification of that. That's the time to buy wine.
Yeah.
Okay? The cons were 3 or 4 years ago, and 10 years before that, when people were cutting prices from $9.99 to $4.99, bog offs. That was a total rip-off. The wines were never worth $9.99. They were always $4.99 wines, and that just wasn't real. But it was incredibly effective. And I'm not saying they were bad wines. It was just very effective marketing, which is why they continued with it. But it was a con. Whereas 25% off everything, that's not a con. That's a supermarket taking a hit. Okay. And you wait for it. So yeah.
Now you mentioned consumption dropping. I think you mentioned in Spain now. Clifford, he goes to Lidl in Spain and Mallorca. Had some great wines from there. You don't advise Lidl in other countries, is that right? Or do you?
I don't advise them in other countries. I do work with Lidl in other countries. I work with Lidl in Germany, Denmark, Poland, Ireland, and absolutely adore that because it's fascinating getting to know different markets. I don't work with them in Spain, but I know the buyers in Spain, and they are really good. I really like what Lidl do in Spain. They are fortunate that Spain has got some fabulous wines to select from. The Spanish wine industry over the last 30 years has reinvented itself. And I mentioned earlier about hygiene. No country demonstrates that better than Spain. And I put Portugal in the same bracket. Mm-hmm. The cellars used to be quite, they were quite dirty. And admittedly, with EU funding, an awful lot of it, they've got fantastic equipment now, fantastic facilities in Spain and Portugal. So they've got some really good wines to choose from. And what I love about Spain at the moment is it is much more than just Rioja. So we're seeing a lot of other areas producing really good wines, which don't have the price premium that Rioja charges. So you get, you mentioned Albarino amongst the whites, and that's a good example. But there's many examples amongst the reds as well. Toro, Calatayud, Jumilia, Yekla. There's a host of them. Biazzo. There's a host of really good red wine producing regions.
Yeah, no, super. Thank you. Now, looking at value and opportunities. And actually, this is a question that I plan to ask you, but we'd had this question pop up earlier. Any little-known wines, styles, regions that you can recommend we try? So if we're looking for some value, you mentioned there, Rioja is an expensive way to buy that style of wine from Spain. You could get something equally as good from a less famous region. Before we came on air, we were talking about the virtues of buying wine from a neighbouring village of Châteauneuf-du-Pape and, somewhere like Rasteau or Vaqueras. Where around the world can we find some of the value, maybe some of the emerging nations that don't command the same price?
I mean, we are, as wine drinkers, as wine lovers, we have never been so fortunate as we are now. I think there's value everywhere in the world. I really do. It is a little bit vintage driven. So it does depend whether any country or region has just had a good vintage. Mm-hmm. But there is value everywhere. I would argue that there's fabulous value in Chile, Argentina, in Europe. Wow. Spain and Portugal, definitely. Some parts of France, the Rhone Valley for me stands out in Bordeaux, in France for value at the moment. Eastern Europe, I think we're going to see a lot more from Bulgaria, Romania, Moldova in the coming years, simply because quality is improving, facilities are becoming more modern, better equipped, and value is outstanding. Greece, again, not necessarily at the less expensive end, but if you're prepared to pay £10 to £15, Greece is unbelievable for the quality of wines you can get. There's so many countries, and I still think there's, from every country, I believe you can find value, but it's a question of knowing what to look for, and it often means looking outside the names that the better known brands. So for me, it does mean if you're looking for value, I wouldn't necessarily go for the best known regions. I wouldn't go for Rioja or Chablis or
No, we're in trouble, Richard. We're in trouble. Laura Clay has posted on Facebook, Rioja is not expensive! Exclamation mark. Sorry, Laura. Sorry. the Rioja ambassador says Rioja.
I'm sure I didn't say Rioja is expensive. I think I might have said there is better value to be found elsewhere.
I think we're still in trouble. Now, Richard, it's that time of the evening for Richard's 20 questions in 2 minutes. It's the bit everyone looks forward to when they come.
I need a drink, Tony.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Okay. Just
no problem.
Topping up.
So I'm just going to, while you're topping up your glass and getting ready for the onslaught, I'm just going to remind you of the rules. So I'm going to give you 20 questions in 2 minutes. And really, it's just two options. You've got to choose one or the other. Don't want any messing around. I need your first answer, and I need it quickly so we can get to the 2 minutes. Richard, here is your 20 questions in 2 minutes. Chardonnay or Sauvignon Blanc?
Chardonnay.
Fine dining or steak and chips?
Steak and chips.
Oaked or unoaked?
Unoaked.
Apple or Android?
Apple.
Margaret River or Napa?
Margaret River.
Bordeaux or Burgundy?
Glass of each, one in each hand.
Come on.
Balanced diet. I can't.
Bordeaux or Burgundy? Come on.
No.
No one said no yet. I'm not happy with that. Okay. Football or hockey?
Hockey.
Cremant or Cava?
Good one. Cremant.
English sparkling or champagne?
English sparkling.
Very good. Cristal or Dom Perignon?
Dom Perignon.
Syrah or Shiraz?
Shiraz.
Malbec or Cabernet Sauvignon?
Cabernet Sauvignon.
New World or Old World?
Old World.
Left bank or right bank?
Left bank.
Georgia or Greece? Go on. Greece. Okay. Rioja or Tuscany?
Tuscany.
Trouble again. Tuscany. Oh my goodness. Cheese before dessert or after dessert?
Before.
Sherry or Madeira?
Madeira.
South America or South Africa?
South America.
South America. Brilliant. Thank you so much. Great sport, Richard. That was your 20 questions in 2 minutes. And I've just got one black mark against your name where you
I know.
on Bordeaux.
Look, Tony, I knew it was coming.
Did you?
Yeah. And I can't.
Okay.
Life would be, funny enough, it's funny you should ask that. Oh, I knew you were going to ask it. This afternoon, I was listening to a podcast. Well, it's a recording from about 4 years ago when Michel Roux was hosting a debate between Jancis Robinson and Hugh Johnson.
Okay.
Hugh Johnson championing Bordeaux, and Jancis championing Burgundy.
Okay.
And it was just coincidence. I happened to listen to some of it this afternoon. And they were coming up with their arguments. It was patently clear, listening to both of them, that they could have argued either case just as well.
Yeah.
And they didn't actually really believe that one was better than the other. And that's exactly how I feel.
Yeah.
Life would be so much the poorer for losing either of them. Can't put one in front of the other.
They're just such fabulous benchmarks, aren't they?
They are. And also the contrast between them. What I love about them is that they're different. They taste different. They go with different types of food. They go with different occasions. And this is why you can't choose between, because it depends on so many other factors.
Probably along with the Rhone
So
Valley.
I'm getting defensive again, aren't I?
Yeah, well, we'll let you off the hook, but not for not giving me an answer. Okay, now, interestingly, would you say that those two regions, along with Rhone Valley, are probably the three most copied styles around the world? The Rhone blend, Bordeaux, and Burgundy. Is that what people aim for on the international market? Do you think, as a benchmark of is their wine good enough?
It's a really good question, and I'd like to think, look, much though I adore France, and a lot of my work is still with France one way or another, I'd like to think that's changing. I don't think they have the influence that they used to. They may do at the very, very top end of the market, so that 0.001% of the market where wines are selling for £300 a bottle plus, yes, they are incredibly important still. But in terms of their influence, no. I would say that now there are certain areas elsewhere in Europe and in the New World which are having just as much influence. I would certainly say that Piemonte is having as much influence with its Barolo and Barbaresco.
Yeah.
Tuscany, Bulgari is having some influence, no question. And in the New World, well, lots of places. You look at South Africa with Swartland and the white blends that they're producing. Australia with its cooler climate Chardonnay, and Margaret River with its white and red blends, absolutely world class. And I haven't talked about Argentina yet, but I mean, I think red wine, I'm still, although I've tasted some brilliant Argentine whites, I still find the average level of Argentine white, it doesn't excite me.
Mm-hmm.
But reds, there are some fantastic Argentine reds. And what I love about them in Argentina is they taste totally different to any other wines. No other country is producing reds quite the same way or quite the same style as Argentina at the moment. And I love that, because many of the wines in the world these days are quite international in style. If you're an MW student, it's an absolute nightmare, because you can't a wine can just be international in style. It's very difficult to identify where it's from.
Yeah.
Argentina is different. And I think with Malbec, increasingly with Cabernet Franc, and with some of their blends, they're producing really distinctive reds. And the fact that also, unlike most countries, it's not as a result of oak aging. They're producing really good wines from concrete and with stainless steel, much less oak. I find it a really bold, just very courageous approach to the whole thing at the top end in Argentina. I'm very excited by what I'm seeing from there. But I'm talking about wines that cost over £10. As it happens, Waitrose have a couple of them, which I think, if anyone's looking for suggestions, Waitrose have a couple that I absolutely adore. They've got a Malbec called Altos Las Hormigas, which is probably about £15. It is beautiful Argentine Malbec, aged in concrete, and really, really fresh. And then there's another one called Colome, C-O-L-O-M-E, which is from one of the highest vineyards in the world. Again, a Malbec. It's probably a bit more. It may be 17, 18 pounds. It's just one of the most beautiful reds. Wonderfully pure fruit. Probably a bit of oak, but it's the fruit that comes through. And this incredible freshness and vitality that Argentina can get at its best reds. Very exciting.
Yeah. So we'll have to make sure that I know you've got some recommendations from you for Lidl, but perhaps if we can make a note of some of those that you've just mentioned there as well, and add those in, and we'll post those later this evening. Now, something I was going to cover later if we had enough time. I'm going to put it out there now that we've 5 minutes to go until the hour. We're going to run over tonight because there's some more questions I want to ask you. Really enjoying listening to you this evening, Richard. So if it's okay with everyone else,
I've got some wine left in the bottle, so it's fine.
Good. We're going to keep going for a little bit longer if that's okay with everyone else. So now, Williams asked, is there any cheap but good English wines? I think I could probably answer this as well. I'd like to contribute toward this. Celebrated English Wine Week last week. I'm wanting to buy more, but a lot seems like it's around the £30 price point. And there is some great stuff at that price point. But it is possible to do English wine at a bit of a lower price point as well, isn't it?
Excuse me. I assume William's talking about sparkling wines rather than still wines, because certainly a lot of the still wines are less expensive than that. Waitrose do a wonderful... shouldn't have had that cashew nut, sorry. Waitrose do a wonderful range of English still wines, you know, between 8 and 10 or 11, 10 to 12 pounds. So sparkling, it's not easy to find them under 30. It's absolutely true. It's one of the reasons I wait till supermarkets are offering 25% off. And one of the wine styles I routinely buy when they're offering 25% off is English sparkling wine.
Yeah. Because
then brands like Ridgeview, Night Timber come well under the £30 mark.
Yeah.
So I just wait. I think that there are Chapel Down, produce some top class. They're one of England's biggest producers, and fortunately they're leading by example with quality. And they produce some top sparkling wines at less than £30, no question. Some of which I think are available in Waitrose and other supermarkets. I think M&S may have something from them as well. And then it's an interesting question because sparkling wine, if it's made by the traditional method, the same method as champagne, it is by definition quite expensive for the most part. And most English sparkling wine is made by that method, but it doesn't have to be. And it's a very topical question at the moment. There's been quite a lot of information, quite a lot of discussion on social media about this recently, because it was English Wine Week last week, so quite rightly. And it is possible to make English sparkling wines by other methods, and that can make them cheaper. And so I would recommend looking for, there's a wine called Fitz, F-I-T-Z, which I don't know, but I think if you Google it, you'll find it. And that, I think, is a less expensive English sparkling wine. Chapel Down produces sparkling Bacchus, and Bacchus is a grape that thrives in England. It does really, really well. I love the sparkling Bacchus. I think it's fun, it's light, it's not too fizzy. It's like a sparkling alcoholic elderflower cordial. Incredibly refreshing, perfect summer drinking. And that's, half £30. I'd really recommend that. If you go on the Chapel Down website, you'll be able to find that. The other producer I think that's worth looking out for, I'm not sure where you'd buy it, but I'm sure you could Google again, is Three Quires. Three Quires are based in Gloucestershire, one of England's oldest and best established producers. They produce really good value wines, sparkling and still, and they have sparkling that isn't too expensive as well. The one thing I would look at, full price, English sparkling wine is expensive. I would argue that most of the time at full price, champagne is expensive. So the conclusion is, don't buy it at full price. Wait until it's on offer. Wait until it's at 25% off and buy 6 bottles, and rather than one, and just make the most of the offers. That's the way sparkling wine makes sense to me. And if I was planning a big occasion, a birthday party or a wedding or anything like that, I would wait. I would plan in advance and buy the sparkling wine when it was on offer. And if you're buying it 25% off, well, that's not so different to the prices you'd be paying if you went over to Calais or something like that.
Absolutely. Now, Chapel Down is one that I always dive in for, on the 25% discount. If they've got that going at, often at Waitrose, do a discount on all their sparkling wines. Great time to buy that. I must admit, I love the Chapel Down Still Bacchus, which is, I think, around the 10, 11, 12 pounds mark.
Yeah.
I think that's a great drop. I was less keen on the sparkling Bacchus personally, but I have to say the Fitz sparkling is superb. It's the house pour at the Craft Dining Rooms in Birmingham, which is English craft dining rooms. It's English food. All the wine is either English or it has some English connection. And it's the house pour there. I have to say, it's absolutely delicious, and it's a prosecco style, but it's very crisp, fresh, good level of acidity, and of course, Night Timber. If you can get that under the £30 mark on a 25% discount, superb.
That's right. That's absolutely right. Yeah.
And I have to say, Chapel Down Rosé, I'm a huge fan of that. I think I picked that up for about £11.99 last week. But I think it's normally around the £14 mark, and just tastes like an English summer. It's absolutely wonderful.
I couldn't agree more. And I noticed that in the comments last week, and I think Oz Clarke said this in his interviews last week as well, that England needs to do more rosé. It's something we do really, really well. We can make Pinot Noir rosé. We can make rosé from other grapes as well. And yes, it's an area that I think we could really specialise in future. A lot of good potential for rosé.
Now here's a headline stealer. So best value UK sparkling wine right now, this is according to Dominic Buckwell, is Ellicombe, and it's branded by Sainsbury, but in fact it's made by Night Timber. So
wow. Well, Dominic would know, that's for sure. That is really interesting. I had no idea that Night Timber did own label. Extraordinary. Thank you, Dominic. I will go and get a bottle.
Yeah, me too.
Or more.
I think so will everyone
else. Get more if it's on promotion.
Yeah.
But that's really useful. Thank you. I didn't know that, but that is so interesting because I'd always associated Night Timber with just their branded sparkling wine, and yet the owner has gone on record recently as saying he's still looking to double production. Which I thought was incredibly bold for a wine selling at his price point. But if he's doing own label as well, then that makes more sense.
Now, back in my Hotel de Van days, we would have winemakers from around the world coming, presenting a different wine dinner, and we would always take them into the bar afterwards for a drink, and we'd pour them a glass of Night Timber because many of them had heard about it. They were doing their promotional tour, if you like, doing a few dinners and tastings. We said, have you tried it Night Timber? Pour them a glass, and they were always blown away. They found that they would think it was champagne. And there's good reason to think why it might be champagne if you were blind tasting it, isn't there? Geographically.
Absolutely. Our climate's not so, or the climate in the South Downs is not so dissimilar to Champagne, and the soils are pretty close as well. So Night Timber has got an awful lot going for it. I must admit, in recent vintages, the last, 5 or 6 years, I've really enjoyed Night Timber. Everyone has. They're setting. I am still very, very excited about the future for English wine. Like many, I'm a bit concerned that we're growing too fast, and I wish we were growing a bit more slowly so that we could manage the growth. But I think that one of the great things we have in our favour is that the bigger producers like Night Timber, Chapel Down, Ridgeview, Gusbourne, they're producing really good wine. They're leading by example. Denbigh's as well. Mm-hmm. They're leading by example. So that if the bigger producers are producing really good wines and at prices that reflect their economies of scale, anyone else has got to do even better. Because anyone else with smaller economies of scale is probably going to be more expensive. So it's really important that the big boys are setting high standards, and they are, no question. And I am hugely excited. I just hope we're patient. because we've got a lot of wine coming on stream, and I think we are going to have to be quite patient. But anyway, there we go. We are where we are, and right now, demand for English wine still exceeds supply, and that's a fabulous position to be in.
And of course, the good vintage helps. 2018, I think, was more than double the production than in the prior year. It's already looking perhaps that this year, with the sunshine that we've had early on, could really help. Now, last week I had Julia Trustram Eve join me for Wine Chat during English Wine Week, and now you must have seen. Well, we've just talked about it. You've seen the wine industry change so dramatically over the recent years. Could you ever have imagined that you would have seen the quality or the volume coming out of England that we've got now?
I first started judging English wine in the early 1990s, and it was pretty soul destroying. The wine, so many of the wines were just, they really weren't enjoyable at all. And you gave them a sort of charity vote and a slap on the back for effort, but that was about it. There was very, very little to get excited about. Mm-hmm. And the transformation in the last 25 years has been remarkable. And we are, quite genuinely, I think we are producing world-class wines. And not just sparkling. I think some of our Chardonnay, our still Chardonnay, is really beginning to turn heads. And the best is yet to come because the vines are still young. I'm very, very excited about the potential status of English wines on a world stage. So it's incredible what's happened. Is it down to climate change? It's helped, but it's certainly not down to that. The main reason is we're just now more skilled. There's a college that you'll be familiar with called Plumpton College down in Sussex, which trains most of the English viticulturalists and winemakers. And they've just done a fabulous job. And the key difference is that 25 years ago, most of the wines were made by amateur winemakers.
Yeah.
And they tasted like it. They weren't clean, they weren't fresh, they had faults. They couldn't stand up to international competition, most of them. Fortunately, there were a few that did, and that gave enough confidence in the industry to continue. But the big difference now is that we have some really skilled people working in the business. And that's a credit to the industry in general, but I think particularly Plumpton, that they've made wine much more attractive as a profession. Mm-hmm. We still, I maybe speaking out of turn here, I think there's plenty of winemakers out there. I think we could still do it with some more viticulturists. So if anyone listening is looking for a career change or isn't quite sure what to do with their lives, I think learning how to grow vines in England, you'd find a job. Because we still need people to look after the vineyards, but it's been a wonderful transformation.
Now you mentioned still Chardonnay, exciting coming out of these isles. Gusbourne, I've got to mention, I think fantastic. Kitts Coty, their kind of single vineyard from Chapel Down, another favourite of mine. I have to give a bit of a shout to Welsh wine as well. I'm really impressed with Anchor Hill.
Yes.
Pinot Noir, probably my favourite British red. Bolney Estate also got some great stuff. But yeah, it's great that we can that there are so many names that are becoming.
It is names. It's sensational, and both of us, when we finish this, will both think of another dozen English producers who we haven't mentioned, who deserve to be mentioned. Yeah. Yeah. And it's just so exciting that that England is where it is. As I say, I wish we could find a way of somehow not regulating the growth, but managing the growth. It's a bit like, how can I put it? In the when I was working for Brown Brothers, Australian wine producers are very, very, they're really good business planners. They're well trained in business planning. And I could feed back to Brown Brothers in Australia that there was a gap in supermarkets for another Australian Chardonnay selling at £7 a bottle.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and that market might be 100,000 bottles for the sake of argument. But what if every other producer is feeding that same information back? Say Yalumba, Penfolds, Lindemans, Rosemount, everyone else is feeding back the same information. Everybody plants vineyards to try and fill that gap. But there's only one place for that wine. And so there was a danger in the early days with Australia in the 1990s, where Australia might have been planting too many vineyards. As it happened, their marketing was so good and the appetite for Australian wine around the world was so strong that they managed to absorb most of what they were producing. But there was still a stage where there was a glut. And you know, they are very, very determined not to let that happen again. And I do think there's a slight risk of the same thing happening with England. On the plus side, given that a high percentage of our production in England is sparkling, and in my view, English sparkling wine ages incredibly well. Mm-hmm. I've got wines that I keep, which are now 20 years old, of English sparkling wine, and they are unbelievably exciting. If there is a glut of English sparkling wine, or English wine in general, and we do end up, you know, sales a bit slower for 3 or 4 years, from a consumer point of view and a quality point of view, I'm not convinced it will be a bad thing. I think there will be some even better wines as a result of it. It's one advantage of traditional method sparkling wine, that it can improve with age. But if I was just making, you know, sort of easy drinking Sauvignon Blanc, that would worry me more, because I'm not sure that always does age as well.
Sure. We hosted a dinner at Hotel de Van. It was Perrier-Jouet, probably one of my favourite champagnes, particularly the Belle Epoque, up against Coates and Seeley. And quite frankly, we expected a landslide. But Coates and Seeley pulled a few curveballs out on the evening, pulling out 20-year-old wines that they're not available for sale, but they went down really, really well on the night. It really surprised us. We were stunned, actually. They were really so good.
Well, I really hope, up till now, because demand for English wine has been so strong, and producers, you know, and it's not easy to make money out of producing wine in England. So most producers will have had to sell most of what they produce. And so I think very few producers will have library stock, old stock of bottles. Ridgeview, I know, have tried, but it's, you know, it's very, very small quantities. I'm sure Night Timber have some. Yep. But I hope that the 2018 vintage, particularly, that's going to be one of the huge bonuses of the 2018 vintage. That should have enabled producers to think, now at last we can just keep a little bit of wine aside, put maybe as reserve wine for future non-vintage blends, but they might also have enough of what they're bottling from that vintage to keep a few cases aside. And it's probably going to be the first vintage. Maybe 2010 gave a few producers a chance, yeah. But there's going to be so little mature English sparkling wine on the market. Hopefully with 2018 that will change things for the future.
Absolutely. Now, can we touch on sustainability? It's a hot topic in the world right now. And, you know, wine comes in a bottle, you pop a cork out of the bottle, maybe it's a screw cap is becoming acceptable these days, which I fully support. So why isn't it sustainable? You know, surely the glass is recyclable. Where is the challenge right now, and why is it such a hot topic?
I mean, I hope that it's a hot topic for manufacturers of everything, not just wine. In wine particularly, I think it is important for wine. I think wine, a lot of people like wine over other alcoholic products and other drinks because they see it as a natural product. And I think wine is going to need to rely on that naturalness and sustainability in the coming years, because I think it will command a certain premium. It's already happening. 2 years ago, if you'd asked me that question, I wouldn't have said it was. I don't think anyone was prepared to pay a premium for organic or biodynamic or sustainable or anything. But all the signs were, certainly before COVID, that people were prepared to pay a premium for something that had sustainable credentials. It's an interesting one. And I was listening to a podcast on this afternoon. In theory, the carbon that is taken in by a plant when it grows, a vine, and that is taken in by the soil, will compensate for the carbon dioxide produced by fermentation. Okay, so those two might balance themselves out. The problem is what happens after that. And recent research has shown that probably up to 50% of a bottle of wine's carbon footprint is in the package. So the bottle, the capsule, the label, maybe the cork or the synthetic cork or the screw cap, and logistics, distribution. Up to 50% of the carbon footprint is in those two things, packaging and distribution. So although it sounds great to be, growing vines and that has to be good for the environment, wine still has a massive carbon footprint outside that. And I think we have to get better at measuring that, and we have to explore ways that we can reduce it. Distribution, there are loads of ways we can reduce it. Already, as a result of recent events, we're seeing a more buy local all over the world and people. And that would certainly help if people sourced more of what they're eating and drinking locally rather than shipping things all over the world. So that would help. But even if you're shipping short distances, I mean, one of the crazy things about wine is that it costs as much to ship a case of wine from Bordeaux as it does from Australia. That's potty. Carbon footprint, I'm not quite sure, but I suspect because the wine from Australia is going to come by truck rather than boat, it may even be higher coming from Bordeaux than from Australia. I'm not sure. So look, there has to be things that we can do with that. And with modern technology, with just-in-time ordering and everything else, we must be able to improve the logistics and the distribution in terms of carbon footprint. The packaging, it's a total no-brainer. I mean, the bottle it's ubiquitous. It's very costly to the environment to produce. I think many of us are very suspicious of recycling schemes. Everyone says, "Oh, it's perfect. Of course, you can recycle glass." I'm never convinced it's quite as simple as that. What if the glass has aluminium foil on it like this? Is it so easy to recycle? I don't know. And glass is, it's not good for the environment to produce. We have to explore alternatives. In the first instance, lower weight glass. I see there's a question about cans. Why not? Look, most of the wine sold in the world, if you don't, just take the UK market, we're both in the UK. In the UK, 95% of wine is drunk to be consumed within 48 hours. People couldn't care less whether it will improve in bottle or anything else. It's bought to be drunk. Does it really have to be in a bottle? Of course it doesn't. It could be bag in box is much better for the environment. Plastic bottles are much better for the environment. Cans are much better for the environment and much easier to recycle. Why do
Jeff Ward says here, paper bottles.
Yes.
I read that today. I saw the headline. I didn't have a chance to read it, but yeah, even paper bottles. But even there's decent quality wine going in bag in box now as well, isn't there?
Absolutely.
Box wine.
Absolutely. And I think that the challenge, I think you've hit the nail on the head. Decent quality wine can be put in those containers. And that's the point. I think people assume that any other package than a glass bottle is somehow inferior quality. And that's what we've got to change. And there are people out there already attempting to change that perception. And we've got wine in bag in box, which can be really classy. Cans, I haven't come across anything really classy in cans yet, but I'm in no doubt that in the next 12 months, because the canning facilities in the UK have received a lot of investment in the last 12 months, I'm in no doubt that in the next 12 months we will see quality wines in cans as well. And when, hopefully, pubs and restaurants are back up to full steam again, draft wine. I think keg wine, selling wine in kegs, reusable kegs, just like beer.
Yeah,
why not? There's absolutely no reason why perfectly good wine can't be kegged. It is, as William has said in the chat box there, it is a question of marketing. And we haven't really addressed that yet. We've said, oh, well, this is possible. And we've asked people what they think, and we've, potted around the edges. But no one's really been bold enough yet. That's not quite true. Bag in box, there are one or two pretty classy bag in box wines out there. And I'd love to see more of that. For me, that's a really convenient package, both for home and actually for restaurants and places to serve by the glass as well.
Now, I understand that Jack Whitehall, the comedian, did his very best to promote not only English wine, but wine in a box on, I think it was Saturday Morning Kitchen last week during English Wine Week, where he consumed half a box during the TV show that only lasted for an hour or so. And was very favourable about it, but was quite unintelligible by the end of the programme, as I gather. Now, the last thing I'm going to talk to you about, because time really is getting on this evening. Richard, thank you so much for spending this time with us this evening. I wanted to touch on Burgundy, and I know that's very difficult to do in a short space of time, but I also wanted to mention Warwick and Joanne have said that the Coates and Seeley wine I'm referring to was indeed the sparkling rosé, La Perfide rosé, which was absolutely sensational. But Laura Clay did a fantastic job of demystifying Bordeaux a few weeks ago to somebody who's not a wine buff, but they enjoy their wine. Help demystify Burgundy and explain how people should be buying Burgundian wine in a nutshell.
Tony, you can't say we're running short of time and then say demystify Burgundy. Those two those two comments just don't go together.
Well, listen, look, I guess where I'm coming from is the New World wine producers did a great job of letting you know what the wine is by telling you the grape on the label. We don't have that benefit in Burgundy, but actually we can simplify it down to tell people what types of grapes are produced in that area and what wine styles. And actually, Bordeaux, I've noticed more and more recently than on their Bordeaux Blanc, they are telling you it's Sauvignon Blanc, aren't they? Because they're trying to shift a bit more and ride on that wave of popularity. So what can we expect from Burgundy, and why is it such a classic, special wine region?
Look, to answer your question simply, there are two main grapes. And that makes it a lot simpler to understand. If you understand that the main white grape is Chardonnay and the main red grape is Pinot Noir, that makes it simpler. I think where it's difficult is that you have lots of different appellations, so lots of different villages that put their name in large letters on the label, larger than the producer, larger than the vintage, and in most Burgundy, you won't see the grape variety. And some of those names like Meursault or Gevrey-Chambertin or Nuit Saint-Georges will be very well known. Some of them will be less well known. As a general rule of thumb, the better you recognize the name, the higher the premium you will probably pay for it. Okay, I think that the value in Burgundy lies very often outside the better known names. I think my answer to this is when you're buying Burgundy, as I said earlier, I wouldn't necessarily look to Burgundy if I was looking to buy inexpensive wines.
Yeah.
I'm not saying there aren't good wines under £15. There are. But Burgundy is a relatively small wine producing area. The wines are in very high demand, and it's not necessarily the area that in that range that I would associate with value. Once you go up that, you get into the different villages. And I see Dominic's comment about 4 levels of expertise, and he's talking about regional, village, Premier Cru, Grand Cru. The trouble is that I still don't think that really, that's only a very small part of the equation. And you'll find some producers whose village wine is more expensive than another producer's Grand Cru. So this is why it's tricky. And people often say that in Burgundy, if you are buying Burgundy, and that means you're probably prepared to spend over £15 on a bottle of wine, I would try to find the producers that you enjoy and like. There are quite a few well-known producers of Burgundy, and I'd follow a producer you like as much as a particular village, or whether it's Premier Cru or Grand Cru. The other thing I would do, and this goes back to what we try to do with Lidl in the talk cards, is replicate the service that you might find in a wine merchant. If I was spending £15 plus on a bottle of wine, I'd get advice. And these days it's easier than ever to do that, because you don't have to go into a wine shop to get that, although I happen to think that's the most pleasurable way of buying wine and getting some advice on what you're buying. But you can do it over the internet. You can Google, you can see what other people say. You've got loads of wine companies these days that are basing their selection on consumer feedback and peer reviews. So you've got all that information out there, and I'd see what other people are saying. It's easier to do that now than it ever has been. Unfortunately, and it does go back to my original point, I don't think the label on its own answers that question. And is it a problem? I mean, I say it's a problem. If the wines are still selling, then it's probably not a problem. I think it's far less of a problem for Burgundy than it is for other areas, because Burgundy generally just seems to command a premium, and they can still, for the most part, sell their wines. But it is tricky. Look, when you're paying that much on a bottle of wine, just do a tiny bit of research and see what other people like, and make notes of what you find you've liked in the past as well. And it may not always be the Premier Crus and the Grand Crus. It could be a lesser known village or a lesser known producer. And very often that is where the best buys lie.
Well, I know you've already sent me some recommendations, Richard. I'd love for you to give us a couple of Burgundy recommendations to add to that. I won't ask for you for those now, but if you could send those to me, a little bit more homework for you. So I know you've given me so much time already. So it is time to say thank you so much for this evening. It's been absolutely fascinating. It's been our longest wine chat by far so far.
I'm the most long-winded interviewer you've had, Tony. That's why.
The people who are watching this after the event will be pleased to know the edited version is only 35 minutes. I'm joking, of course. I'm joking. No, you've been brilliant, and it will be unedited. It's been all very interesting. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you to everyone for your contribution, sending those comments and questions in. I'm sorry that we haven't got to all of those questions tonight, but as you can see, we've already done an extra 50% more time. This is a wine events company event. Everything's kind of free and virtual at the moment because we're not able to be out in restaurants doing tasting dinners or cinema events. So it's been fantastic to speak to some of my favourite people in the wine industry and get to absorb some of the information that you've soaked up over many years. So thank you so much for your time tonight, Richard. I'll just quickly touch on next week. I'm joined by Sam Olive of Wine Freedom. So Wine Freedom are a wine merchant that stocks only natural wine, and Sam's going to be demystifying natural wine for us. Sam's actually the curator of the Hampton Manor Wine List, which won AA Wine List of the Year last year. So I'm sure he's going to be talking to us about that and how the Michelin star restaurant Peels has got such a fantastic wine list and how he came about that. But tonight's been all about you, Richard. Thank you so much for your time, and very, very much appreciated. We're going to be posting some recommendations online, and thank you to everybody else for joining us and making this worth doing. Cheers.
Thanks for the invitation, Tony. The glass is empty. I've been enjoying it.
Yeah. Cheers, Richard. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, good night.
Good night.